The night was unnervingly quiet as Jessica stumbled through the dense forest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The sharp twigs and branches tore at her bare legs, the cold night air stinging her exposed skin. She was dressed in nothing but a thin tank top and a pair of shorts, remnants of the day she'd spent at the lakeside cabin with her friends. How did it all go so wrong? Just hours ago, she and her friends were laughing, drinking, and toasting marshmallows over a roaring fire. The cabin, a rustic getaway deep in the woods, was supposed to be a retreat from the pressures of their final year at college. But now, the woods that had seemed so idyllic were a living nightmare, and she was running for her life. It had started as a joke. "Let's tell ghost stories," Dave had suggested, his grin mischievous. They'd all gathered around, taking turns telling the scariest tales they could think of. Jessica had listened, half amused, half bored, until Dave told the story of the Silent Stalker, a local legend about a killer who haunted the woods, preying on those who ventured too far from the cabin. "He waits for the night, when you're most vulnerable," Dave had said, lowering his voice to a whisper. "He hunts you down, and when he catches you, you'll never make a sound." They'd all laughed it off, but the tension lingered in the air. Jessica had felt it, too, the creeping sense of unease, the way the shadows seemed to lengthen, the fire's warmth not quite reaching her. She had excused herself to go to the bathroom, needing a moment alone. That's when she first heard it, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, something moving in the darkness. She'd paused, heart thudding in her chest, but when nothing else happened, she'd shaken it off as her imagination playing tricks on her. But the feeling didn't go away. It followed her as she returned to the group, as they shared more drinks, as the fire crackled and the night grew darker. And then, it happened. The scream. It pierced the night, sharp and terrified, and everything fell apart. Jessica had spun around just in time to see her friend Lisa being dragged into the woods by a figure shrouded in shadow. They had all frozen, paralyzed by shock and fear, until the screams abruptly stopped, leaving an awful, ringing silence. Then, chaos erupted. Everyone scattered in different directions, each trying to find safety, to hide, to escape the terror that had descended upon them. Jessica had run, too, but now she was alone, lost in a maze of trees and shadows, her friend's fate unknown. The sound of snapping twigs jolted her back to the present, her heart racing with renewed fear. She glanced over her shoulder, eyes wide, searching for any sign of the killer. The darkness pressed in from all sides, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of her. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, and she tried to quiet them, knowing that every sound could give away her location. She forced herself to move, her legs trembling with exhaustion and terror. She had to keep going, had to find a way out. The forest seemed endless, the trees stretching into infinity, each one looking the same as the last. She stumbled over a root and nearly fell, catching herself just in time. The ground was uneven, covered in rocks and fallen branches that made every step a struggle. Her mind raced, trying to remember the way back to the cabin, but everything was a blur. She had no sense of direction, no idea where she was going. All she knew was that she had to keep moving. Stopping meant certain death. A flash of movement caught her eye, and she froze, staring into the darkness. There was nothing there, but she could feel it, the presence of something watching her, stalking her. The Silent Stalker, she thought, the name sending a shiver down her spine. "Please, no," she whispered to herself, the words barely audible. "Not like this." But there was no one to hear her, no one to help her. She was alone, lost in the woods, and the killer was out there, somewhere, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Jessica forced herself to move again, each step feeling heavier than the last. The cold night air bit at her skin, the thin fabric of her tank top offering little protection. Her bare feet ached from the rough terrain, but she barely noticed. All that mattered was getting away. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and silence, each tree a potential hiding spot for the killer. She tried to stay quiet, moving as stealthily as she could, but every step seemed to echo in the stillness. The rustling leaves, the crunch of twigs underfoot, it all felt too loud, too obvious. Then, she heard it. The faintest of sounds, a whisper of movement in the distance. She froze, her heart pounding in her ears, her breath catching in her throat. It was closer now, the presence she had sensed earlier. She turned, peering into the darkness, but there was nothing, just the endless expanse of trees and shadows. And then, she saw him. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing just a few feet away. He was tall, his face obscured by a mask, his body clad in dark, tattered clothes that blended seamlessly with the night. He held a large, gleaming knife in one hand, the blade catching the faint light that filtered through the trees. Jessica's breath hitched, her body frozen in place, every instinct screaming at her to run. But she couldn't move, couldn't tear her gaze away from the figure standing before her. He tilted his head slightly, as if steadying her, and then took a step forward. That was all it took to break the spell. Jessica turned and ran, her feet pounding the ground as she sprinted through the forest. Branches whipped at her face, the rough terrain tripping her up, but she didn't stop. The only thought in her mind was to get away, to put as much distance between herself and the killer as possible. But he was fast. She could hear his footsteps behind her, gaining on her with every passing second. The panic surged within her, driving her forward, her lungs burning with the effort. She didn't know how long she could keep running, how long she could evade him. She burst into a small clearing, the moonlight illuminating the open space. Her eyes darted around, searching for anything she could use as a weapon or a hiding spot. But the clearing was empty, offering no cover, no means of defense. Jessica knew she couldn't outrun him forever. Desperation clawed at her as she scanned the area, her mind racing for a solution. And then, she saw it, a large, fallen tree at the edge of the clearing, its roots partially exposed. Without thinking, she darted toward the tree, dropping to the ground and scrambling under the exposed roots. The space was tight, barely large enough to accommodate her, but it offered some cover, some chance of hiding. She pressed herself against the dirt, trying to control her breathing, willing herself to be as silent as possible. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until she could hear the killer's heavy breathing. She clenched her fists, every muscle in her body tensed, waiting. The killer entered the clearing, his dark figure moving with an eerie calm. He stopped, standing in the center of the clearing, scanning the area. Jessica held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She watched as he moved closer to the tree, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the ground. He was close now, so close that she could see the gleam of his knife, the dark stains on the blade. She prayed he wouldn't find her, that he would move on, search elsewhere. But he didn't. He took another step closer, his gaze fixed on the spot where she was hiding. Jessica's mind raced. She had no way out, no way to escape. She could feel the panic rising within her, threatening to overwhelm her. She had to do something, anything, to survive. She reached down, her fingers closing around a small, sharp rock half buried in the dirt. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She held it tightly, waiting for the moment when he would reach down, when she would have a chance to strike. But the killer paused, his head cocked to the side as if listening for something. For a brief moment, he seemed distracted, his attention elsewhere. Jessica seized the opportunity, launching herself out from under the tree with a scream, rock in hand. She drove the sharp edge into his leg, hoping to wound him enough to give her a chance to escape. The killer let out a grunt of pain, staggering back as blood soaked through his pants. But it wasn't enough to stop him. His hand shot out, grabbing her by the hair, yanking her back with a force that made her cry out. Jessica struggled, kicking and clawing, but he was too strong. He flung her to the ground, pinning her beneath him as he raised the knife. She saw the blade glint in the moonlight, felt the cold metal against her skin as he pressed it to her throat. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Jessica stared up at the mask that hid his face, her mind racing with terror and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. But there was no escape, no miracle rescue. The killer's grip tightened, the knife pressing harder against her skin, drawing a thin line of blood. And then, with a swift, brutal motion, the blade came down. The last thing Jessica saw was the dark, cold eyes behind the mask, watching as the life drained from her body, the forest around her growing darker, colder, until there was nothing left but silence.